Imagine standing before stone structures so carefully built that even today, their methods remain uncertain. Across different landscapes, mountains, deserts, and high plateaus, ancient builders shaped stone with a level of control that still raises questions. These were not accidental constructions, they were planned, measured, and executed with intent. Massive blocks were moved, fitted, and aligned in ways that suggest knowledge we don't fully understand. Chandbauri upper structures. Chandbauri is located in the village of Abhaneri, in the eastern part of Rajasthan, India. The region lies within a semi-arid zone where seasonal rainfall is unpredictable and temperatures regularly exceed extreme limits. Water availability has always shaped settlement here, not just as a resource, but as a central organizing concern of daily life. The structure known today as Chandbauri dates primarily to the early medieval period, with its earliest construction generally placed between the 8th and 9th centuries CE. While Chandbauri is most famous for its vast, stepped geometry descending into the earth, the upper structures surrounding the well are equally important for understanding how the site functioned as a lived architectural space. From ground level, Chandbauri presents a carefully organized complex rather than a single feature. The upper structures consist of multi-story galleries, pillared corridors, and platforms that frame the opening of the stepwell. These elements were not decorative additions. They were integral to how people accessed, used, and experienced the site. The stepwell itself descends more than 13 levels into the ground, but access to those depths begins at the top. The upper galleries provided controlled points of entry, shade, and movement. In a climate where exposure to sun could be dangerous, these shaded spaces were essential. The galleries are built from stone, arranged in repetitive linear forms that emphasize order and stability. Pillars support flat stone roofs, creating long corridors that run parallel to the edges of the well. These corridors allowed people to circulate without descending immediately, offering rest points and observation areas above the water. The placement of these structures reflects careful environmental planning. Openings allow air to move through the space, reducing heat buildup. Stone surfaces absorb and slowly release temperature, creating a cooler microclimate near the well. The upper levels were designed to manage heat as much as movement. Chandbauri was not simply an infrastructure project. The presence of temples and shrines integrated into the upper complex indicates ritual use alongside practical function. Water, in Indian cosmology, is both a physical necessity and a sacred substance. The architecture reflects this dual role. One side of the stepwell complex includes a temple structure dedicated to Harshit Mata, a local deity associated with joy and prosperity. This placement is significant. The temple is not isolated from the water source. It overlooks it, reinforcing the connection between ritual practice and resource management. The upper platforms would have served as gathering spaces. People came here not only to collect water, but to meet, rest, and participate in communal activity. The scale of the upper architecture suggests accommodation of large numbers rather than individual use. Unlike wells designed solely for extraction, Chandbauri functions as a social space. The architecture slows movement, encourages pause, and creates layered experiences as one moves from open sunlight into shade, from exterior ground into descending depth. Construction of the upper structures required precise stone cutting and alignment. The horizontal lines of the galleries contrast with the descending diagonal geometry of the steps below. This visual tension emphasizes both stability above and complexity beneath. The stone used in the upper levels was sourced locally. Builders relied on dry masonry techniques, stacking carefully shaped blocks without mortar. Stability came from weight, balance, and repetition, rather than bonding material. The symmetry of the upper structures is deliberate. It creates a sense of order that contrasts with the natural unpredictability of water availability. Architecture here acts as a mediator between environment and human need. Importantly, the upper structures also controlled access. Not all movement into the well was unrestricted. The design allows for supervision and regulation, which would have been essential during periods of scarcity. Over time, the complex underwent repairs and additions, but the fundamental organization remained consistent. This continuity suggests that the original design successfully met long-term needs, rather than requiring constant redesign. Chandbauri's upper architecture demonstrates that stepwells were not secondary structures hidden below ground. They were prominent civic works, integrated into daily life and religious practice. The upper levels define how the site is approached, experienced, and remembered. They frame the descent, guide movement, and establish Chandbauri as both an engineered solution and a social space. The relationship between these upper structures and the descending well beneath them reveals a broader architectural philosophy, one that treats water access as a communal, managed, and meaningful activity rather than a purely functional task. Ar-Rasas underground structures. Ar-Rasas is located in central Jordan, east of the Dead Sea, within a semi-arid plateau shaped by low rainfall, seasonal wadis, and long exposure to wind and heat. From a distance, the site appears modest. Low stone walls, scattered ruins, and open ground do not immediately suggest complexity. Much of what defined Ar-Rasas, however, exists below the surface. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Ar-Rasas, also known historically as Castron Mefa'a. Occupation here spans many centuries, from the Roman period through the Byzantine and early Islamic eras. Throughout these phases, survival depended not on monumental visibility, but on controlled use of space, water, and storage, much of it underground. The region surrounding Ar-Rasas receives limited and unpredictable rainfall. Permanent rivers are absent. In such conditions, underground infrastructure becomes essential. The settlement's continued occupation was made possible through an extensive system of cisterns, channels, and subterranean chambers designed to collect, store, and protect water. These underground cisterns were carved or constructed beneath courtyards, streets, and buildings. Rainwater was directed from roofs and open surfaces through stone-lined channels into sealed underground reservoirs. Once stored, water remained cool and protected from evaporation and contamination. The scale of this system indicates planning at the settlement level rather than household improvisation. Cisterns were positioned to serve multiple structures, suggesting shared management rather than individual ownership. Access points were narrow and controlled, often covered when not in use. Beyond water storage, underground spaces at Ar-Rasas served additional functions. Subsurface rooms and chambers provided stable temperatures throughout the year, making them suitable for food storage. Grain, oil, and other perishables could be kept longer, underground than above ground in the open heat. These spaces were not isolated features. They were integrated into surface architecture. Buildings were constructed with awareness of what lay beneath them, aligning walls and courtyards with underground chambers to ensure structural stability. The surface remains at Ar-Rasas include churches, residential buildings, and defensive walls, but none of these would have functioned effectively without the subsurface system supporting them. The underground infrastructure made long-term occupation viable in an otherwise marginal environment. One of the defining characteristics of Ar-Rasas is its continuity. Rather than being abandoned and rebuilt entirely, the site adapted. Underground systems were cleaned, repaired, and reused across centuries. This continuity suggests that later inhabitants recognized the value of earlier engineering rather than replacing it. During the Byzantine period, Ar-Rasas developed into a significant Christian center, evidenced by churches and mosaics. The most famous of these is the mosaic map in the Church of St. Stephen. Yet even during this period of visible religious expression, the underground systems remained essential and unchanged in principle. The presence of monasteries and isolated religious structures around the site further emphasizes the role of underground infrastructure. Ascetic communities required reliable water access, while remaining separated from dense urban centers. Subsurface systems allowed this balance. The settlement's fortifications also relate to its underground design. Defensive walls enclosed not just buildings, but access to water. Protecting cisterns was as important as protecting inhabitants. Control of subsurface access points would have been critical during periods of conflict or siege. Archaeological surveys reveal that some underground features extend beyond the main walled area. This suggests that water management and storage were not limited to elite or central zones, but distributed across the settlement and its outskirts. Construction methods varied depending on function. Some cisterns were rock-cut directly into bedrock. Others were lined with stone and sealed with waterproof plaster. These techniques reflect knowledge of local geology and material behavior. Maintenance of underground systems required regular labor. Sediment had to be removed, linings repaired, and access points managed. This implies organized communal responsibility rather than ad hoc use. Importantly, these underground structures were not hidden in the sense of secrecy. They were concealed for protection and efficiency, not exclusion. Their entrances were known, marked, and integrated into daily movement. The reliance on underground space shaped how MRSAs functioned socially. Water collection followed schedules. Storage was regulated. Access was shared. Architecture reinforced cooperation rather than individual control. When political authority shifted from Byzantine to early Islamic rule, the underground systems continued to be used. This persistence shows that practical infrastructure outlasted religious and administrative change. Eventually, ar-Rasas declined as regional trade routes shifted and population patterns changed. When the site was abandoned, the underground systems were left intact, sealed beneath debris rather than dismantled. Excavation reveals these spaces gradually. What emerges is a settlement defined as much by what lies beneath as by what stands above. The underground structures of Omarasas demonstrate a form of architecture focused on endurance rather than display, responding directly to environmental constraint through planning, cooperation, and long-term maintenance. Takalikabaj stone alignments. Takalikabaj is located on the Pacific slope of southwestern Guatemala, at the edge of the coastal Piedmont where volcanic highlands descend toward fertile lowlands. The region is marked by rich soils, heavy seasonal rainfall, and access to natural trade routes connecting the Pacific coast with the interior highlands. These environmental conditions supported early agriculture and long-term settlement earlier than in many other parts of Mesoamerica. The site is identified archaeologically as Takalikabaj, and it is one of the most important transitional sites in Mesoamerican archaeology. Occupation began as early as 1000 BCE and continued for more than a millennium. What makes Takalikabaj distinctive is that it preserves evidence of cultural continuity between the Olmec tradition and the later Maya world. At first glance, Takalikabaj does not present itself as a single monumental complex. Instead, it consists of a wide distribution of stone monuments, platforms, terraces, and alignments spread across rolling terrain. The site was shaped gradually rather than imposed all at once, reflecting long-term adaptation rather than centralized redesign. Among its most significant features are the stone alignments that organize space across the site. These alignments are formed by stelae, altars, and worked stone blocks placed along deliberate axes. They do not form closed enclosures. Instead, they structure movement and sight lines through open space. The stones themselves vary in size and form. Some are tall stelae carved from basalt, while others are low, roughly shaped blocks. Many show signs of reuse. Stones were repositioned, reoriented, or recarved as cultural priorities changed, indicating continuity rather than replacement. Orientation is a key feature of these alignments. Archaeological study has shown that several alignments correspond to solar events, particularly solstices and equinoxes. These orientations are not isolated features. They appear repeatedly across different construction phases, suggesting sustained attention to astronomical observation. Unlike later Maya cities with rigidly planned plazas and pyramids, Takalikabaj exhibits flexibility. Alignments were adjusted as new monuments were added. This suggests that observation and ritual practice were dynamic, not fixed to a single canonical layout. The alignments also relate to water and landscape. Many stones are positioned with reference to nearby streams, slopes, and volcanic features. In Mesoamerican cosmology, mountains, water sources, and celestial movement were deeply interconnected. Architecture served to mediate these relationships rather than dominate them. Takalikabaj contains some of the earliest known Maya-style monuments, including stelae with early hieroglyphic inscriptions. These appear alongside earlier Olmec-style carvings, creating a layered visual record of cultural transition rather than abrupt change. The presence of Olmec-style iconography indicates early participation in long-distance exchange networks. Basalt used for monuments was transported from volcanic regions some distance away, implying organized labor and regional coordination. Stone alignment at Takalikabaj should not be understood as purely observational. These axes also structured ritual movement. Processions, offerings, and gatherings would have followed these lines, embedding astronomical time into social practice. The open nature of the site suggests that access was not tightly restricted. Unlike later elite-controlled ceremonial centers, Takalik Abaj appears to have accommodated broad participation. Architecture here guided behavior rather than confined it. The alignment of monuments also served memory. Stones marked places where rituals occurred repeatedly, anchoring tradition to specific locations. Even as iconography and language changed, the spatial framework persisted. Construction methods were practical and incremental. Platforms were built from packed earth and stone, then resurfaced over time. Alignments were reinforced as needed. This approach allowed continuity without large-scale demolition. The absence of massive pyramids at Takalik Abaj is significant. Monumentality here is expressed through placement and repetition rather than height. Authority was embedded in spatial order rather than vertical dominance. The site's longevity suggests that its alignment system remained meaningful across cultural transitions. Olmec traditions did not vanish. They were absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted within emerging Maya frameworks. Archaeological excavation shows that many monuments were intentionally buried or repositioned rather than destroyed. This practice preserves symbolic value while allowing new expressions to emerge. Takalik Abaj demonstrates that early Mesoamerican architecture was not static. It evolved through dialogue between generations, belief systems, and environmental conditions. The stone alignments form a kind of architectural language, one that expresses time, place, and continuity without enclosing space or forcing uniformity. Understanding these alignments requires attention to how people moved through the site, how they observed the sky, and how ritual practice adapted over centuries rather than remaining fixed. Tiahuanaco Acapana Pyramid. The Acapana Pyramid stands at the heart of the ancient city of Tiwanaku, near the southern shores of Lake Titicaca in modern-day Bolivia. This region lies at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, where oxygen is thin, temperatures fluctuate sharply, and agriculture depends on careful environmental management. Any large-scale construction here reflects not only social organization, but deep adaptation to extreme conditions. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Tiwanaku, and the Acapana is one of its most prominent architectural features. Construction of the pyramid began around the middle of the first millennium CE, during the period when Tiwanaku emerged as a major political and ceremonial center in the Andean highlands. The Acapana is not a smooth-sided pyramid. It is a large, stepped platform structure with a flattened summit, built from earth, stone, and carefully shaped masonry. From a distance, its form appears geometric, but subdued, blending into the plateau rather than dominating it through height alone. The pyramid was constructed in multiple stages. Earlier versions were expanded and reshaped over time, creating a layered structure rather than a single monumental event. This incremental growth reflects long-term planning and sustained communal investment rather than short-term display. One of the most distinctive aspects of the Acapana is its internal water management system. Channels, conduits, and stone-lined drains were integrated into the structure itself. Rainwater was directed across terraces and down through the pyramid in controlled paths, preventing erosion while shaping ritual movement. Water held central importance in Tiwanaku society. In a high-altitude environment where rainfall was seasonal and unpredictable, managing water was both a practical necessity and a symbolic act. The Acapana appears to have functioned as a kind of artificial mountain, mirroring natural hydrological processes. The summit of the pyramid contained a sunken court or basin, which collected water before releasing it through the internal drainage system. This design suggests deliberate choreography of water flow rather than simple runoff control. Stone blocks used in the Acapana include both roughly shaped fieldstone and finely dressed andesite. The most precisely cut stones were used at corners, channels, and key structural points, indicating selective application of skilled masonry rather than uniform treatment. Transporting stone at this altitude required coordination across the landscape. Some materials were sourced from quarries several kilometers away, implying organized labor systems and shared obligations rather than individual effort. Unlike later Inca architecture, Tiwanaku construction does not rely on tight-fitting polygonal stonework throughout. Instead, precision is concentrated where function demands it. This reflects a practical approach to monumentality grounded in use rather than appearance. The Acapana's orientation aligns broadly with cardinal directions, reinforcing its role as a central organizing feature within the city. Nearby ceremonial spaces, plazas, and pathways relate spatially to the pyramid, forming an integrated urban plan. Excavations have revealed evidence of ritual activity associated with the Akapana. Offerings, animal remains, and symbolic objects suggest that the pyramid was not merely a platform, but an active ceremonial space where movement, water, and elevation were combined. Human remains found at the site indicate that ritual sacrifice may have been part of activity associated with the pyramid. These findings point toward a complex religious system in which architecture structured both ceremony and power. The Akapana was not isolated. It functioned within a broader ceremonial complex that included the Kalasasaya platform, the semi-subterranean temple, and residential zones. Together, these elements created a city, organized around ritual and seasonal cycles. Tiwanaku society relied heavily on raised field agriculture in the surrounding landscape, a system that buffered crops against frost and drought. The symbolic emphasis on water and elevation at the Akapana reflects the same environmental logic expressed architecturally. The pyramid's step design controlled access. Movement upward was gradual and deliberate, reinforcing transition rather than allowing immediate entry to the summit. This suggests regulated participation rather than unrestricted gathering. Over time, maintenance of the Akapana declined. Drainage systems became clogged, erosion increased, and parts of the structure collapsed. These changes reflect broader social and environmental shifts affecting the Tiwanaku state. When Tiwanaku was eventually abandoned around the 11th century CE, the Akapana remained as a massive earth and stone form, gradually weathering but retaining its underlying organization. Later cultures in the region did not dismantle the pyramid entirely, suggesting that the site retained symbolic significance even after its original use ended. Modern archaeological work has revealed the complexity of the Akapana's construction and function, challenging earlier interpretations that viewed it as a simple mound. The pyramid's design demonstrates that monumentality at Tiwanaku was expressed through integration of water, stone, movement, and landscape, rather than through isolated architectural spectacle. The Akapana continues to shape how the site is experienced. Al-Nasla Stone. Al-Nasla Stone is located near the Tema Oasis in northwestern Saudi Arabia, a region that has supported human activity for thousands of years, despite its arid environment. Tema sits along historic caravan routes that once connected the Arabian Peninsula with the Levant and Mesopotamia. Water availability made this oasis a natural point of rest, trade, and long-term settlement. The formation is known archaeologically as the Al-Nazla Stone. It consists of two large sandstone blocks standing upright, separated by an extremely narrow and straight vertical gap. The symmetry of this split has drawn attention because it appears unusually precise when compared to natural fractures typically found in desert rock formations. Each half of the stone stands balanced on a small base, giving the impression that the rock was intentionally positioned. However, geological processes can produce fractures that appear artificial, particularly in sandstone exposed to long-term stress, erosion, and thermal expansion. Understanding Al-Nazla requires placing it within its geological context. The sandstone formations around Tema were shaped over millions of years by sediment deposition, tectonic pressure, and erosion. Sandstone is layered and relatively brittle, which makes it susceptible to clean fractures under certain conditions. The vertical split at Al-Nazla follows a natural plane of weakness within the rock. Over time, repeated heating and cooling cycles, combined with subtle ground movement, can widen such fractures. Wind erosion then smooths exposed surfaces, further emphasizing straight edges. What makes Al-Nazla stand out is not only the split itself, but the stability of the two halves. Both sections remain upright rather than collapsing outward. This stability is due to the broader base of each half and the distribution of weight across the underlying rock surface. Petroglyphs carved into the surface of the stone indicate human interaction with the formation long after it fractured. These carvings depict human figures and animals, and are consistent with rock art found across northern Arabia. Their presence confirms that the site held significance for people who lived or passed through the region. The carvings do not align with the fracture in a way that suggests the split was made to accommodate them. Instead, they appear to have been added after the stone had already separated, implying that the formation was already distinctive when people encountered it. Tema Oasis itself has archaeological evidence of occupation dating back to at least the Bronze Age. Fortifications, inscriptions, and wells show that this area was an established settlement long before the rise of later Arabian kingdoms. In such environments, Prominent natural features often became landmarks. They served as navigation points, meeting places, or culturally meaningful markers within a largely open landscape. Al-Nazla's striking appearance would have made it easy to recognize and remember. There's no archaeological evidence that tools were used to split the stone. No chisel marks, tool scars, or quarry debris have been identified. The fracture surface lacks the irregular patterns typically associated with human cutting of stone. From a scientific perspective, the precision of the split does not require advanced technology to explain. Natural jointing in sandstone can produce linear fractures, especially when influenced by tectonic stress. Similar formations exist elsewhere, though few are as visually dramatic. What remains important is how humans responded to the stone, not whether they created it. The presence of petroglyphs suggests that people recognized the formation as noteworthy and chose to interact with it symbolically rather than physically altering it. The stone's location near an oasis reinforces this interpretation. Travelers moving through the region would have encountered Al-Nasla as part of a broader landscape of survival and movement, where distinctive features gained meaning through repetition and memory. Unlike built monuments, Al-Nazla does not impose order on the landscape. It emerges from it. Its significance lies in recognition rather than construction. The balance of the stone halves creates a visual tension that draws attention, but the absence of surrounding architecture suggests that the site was not formalized into a structured ritual space. This distinction matters. Many ancient societies did not separate natural and constructed sacred places. A formation like Al-Nasla could hold meaning without modification, serving as a point of reference rather than a destination built for ceremony. Later attention to the stone, particularly in modern times, has focused on its appearance rather than its context. Archaeologically, its value lies in how it fits into a long tradition of human engagement with natural landmarks in arid environments. The stone continues to stand, exposed to wind and temperature shifts, slowly weathering but retaining its defining split. Its persistence reflects the same environmental forces that shaped it. Al-Nazla demonstrates that not all significant ancient sites were constructed. Some were recognized, named, and remembered because they already stood apart from their surroundings. Its role within the Tama landscape is best understood through continuity, as a natural feature that became culturally meaningful through repeated human attention rather than deliberate engineering. Aramu Muru. Aramu Muru is located in southern Peru, not far from the western shores of Lake Titicaca, within a high-altitude landscape defined by open plains, rocky outcrops, and strong seasonal winds. The region sits at more than 3,800 meters above sea level, where daily life requires constant adjustment to cold temperatures, thin air, and intense sunlight. Stone dominates the terrain, shaping both natural formations and human construction. The site is known archaeologically as Aramu Muru, and is also referred to locally as Hayu Marca. Unlike large ceremonial centers or monumental complexes, Aramu Muru consists of a single carved feature cut directly into a natural rock face. Its simplicity is part of what has drawn sustained attention. The carving takes the form of a rectangular doorway recessed into a vertical stone surface. The opening measures several meters in height, with a smaller niche carved into the back wall at ground level. There's no passage beyond the doorway. It does not lead into a chamber or corridor. The stone behind it remains solid. The carving is precise, edges are straight, surface is flattened, and proportions consistent. The doorway is centered and balanced, suggesting intentional design rather than casual modification. At the same time, the surrounding rock has not been shaped or built up. The feature exists in isolation, without associated walls, platforms, or enclosures. Dating Aramu Muru is difficult. No inscriptions, ceramics, or organic material are directly associated with the carving. Most archaeologists cautiously associate it with the late pre-Inca or Inca period, based on carving style and regional context, though earlier origins cannot be ruled out. Stone carving of this kind requires planning and sustained effort. The bedrock is hard, and shaping it would have involved repeated percussion and abrasion using stone tools. This was not a spontaneous act. The doorway was laid out, measured, and executed deliberately. The absence of a functional interior raises important questions. Aramu Muru is not an entrance in the conventional sense. It does not provide shelter, storage, or access. Its purpose was not practical in the everyday sense. In Andean cultures, Carved stone often served symbolic rather than utilitarian roles. Rock faces, caves, and outcrops were understood as living elements of the landscape. Mountains known as apus were regarded as powerful entities with agency. Altering stone could be a way of marking or engaging with these forces. Within this worldview, a carved doorway doesn't need to lead anywhere physically to be meaningful. The act of carving may itself have been the purpose, creating a threshold or marker within the landscape. The smaller niche carved at the base of the doorway is significant. Similar niches appear in Inca and pre-Inca architecture and are often associated with offerings or ritual placement. Objects placed here would have been visible, framed by the larger doorway above. The site's location supports ritual interpretation. Armu Muru is not positioned within a settlement or agricultural zone. It lies apart, requiring deliberate travel. Reaching it is a choice rather than a convenience. Visibility also plays a role. The doorway faces open space rather than being hidden within a narrow gorge or enclosed area. This orientation suggests that approach and presence mattered more than concealment. Local traditions and later interpretations have associated the site with myths of passage or transformation. While these stories developed long after the site's creation, they reflect how the feature's form invites interpretation as a boundary or transition rather than a structure. Archaeologically, there's no evidence of mechanical alteration beyond carving. No metal residues, tool marks indicating advanced cutting, or signs of later modification have been identified. The techniques used are consistent with known Andean stoneworking methods. Comparisons are often made between Aramamuru and rock-cut features elsewhere in the Andes, including niches, doorways, and carved facades found at sites like Tiwanaku and Inca centers. In these contexts, carved stone frequently marks sacred or significant points in the landscape. Unlike those sites, however, Aramamuru lacks surrounding architecture. This absence suggests a focused purpose. The doorway itself was the destination, not part of a larger built environment. The high-altitude setting reinforces this focus. Environmental conditions limit long-term occupation but heighten sensory experience. Sound carries differently. Light changes rapidly. Stone surfaces respond visibly to weather and time. The carving's endurance is partly due to this environment. Low rainfall and limited vegetation have preserved edges and surfaces that would have weathered more quickly in humid regions. The lack of archaeological debris around the site suggests that activity here was intermittent rather than continuous. People likely came for specific occasions rather than daily use. This pattern aligns with many Andean ritual sites, which were visited seasonally or for particular ceremonies rather than occupied permanently. Masuda no Iwafune. Masuda no Iwafune is located in the Asuka region of Nara Prefecture, Japan, an area known for its dense concentration of early state period sites. The landscape here is shaped by low hills, forested slopes, and narrow valleys, forming a terrain that has supported settlement and ritual activity for thousands of years. Within this environment lies one of the most unusual carved stone monuments in East Asia. The monument is identified archaeologically as Masuda no Iwafune. It consists of a single massive block of granite, estimated to weigh more than 700 tons, carved into a highly regular geometric form. Unlike standing stones, tombs, or architectural foundations, Masuda no Iwafune does not resemble any known functional structure. The stone is roughly rectangular in plan, with sharply cut edges and flat surfaces. Its upper face is particularly distinctive, featuring two square depressions carved symmetrically into the top. A straight groove runs between them, dividing the surface into two equal halves. The precision of these cuts immediately sets the monument apart from natural rock formations. The stone is not freestanding. It emerges directly from the bedrock, indicating that it was carved in place rather than quarried and transported. This choice is significant. Working a stone of this size in situ required long-term commitment and planning, rather than opportunistic modification. Dating Masuda no Iwafune has been the subject of debate. Most scholars place its creation in the Asuka period, roughly between the 6th and 7th centuries CE, a time when Japan was undergoing rapid political and cultural transformation. Centralized authority was emerging, Buddhism was being introduced, and monumental construction increased dramatically. The Asuka region contains numerous stone structures from this period, including tombs, platforms, and ritual features. However, Masuda no Iwafune does not fit comfortably into any of these categories. It is not a tomb. No burial chamber, passage, or remains have been identified. It is not a foundation, as no structure was built upon it. The geometry of the carving suggests deliberate measurement. Edges are straight, angles are consistent, and surfaces are leveled. Achieving this degree of regularity in granite using iron tools would have required skill, time, and controlled technique. Granite is one of the hardest stones commonly worked in ancient construction. Shaping it requires repeated hammering, abrasion, and finishing. The scale of Masuda no Iwafune implies sustained labor by specialists rather than casual effort. The two square depressions on the top surface are particularly puzzling. They are evenly spaced and carefully shaped, yet they don't correspond to sockets for posts or structural elements. Their depth and finish suggest containment rather than attachment. Various interpretations have been proposed over time. Some suggest the stone was an unfinished tomb or monument, abandoned before completion. Others propose astronomical, calendrical, or symbolic functions. None of these interpretations can be confirmed through direct evidence. What is clear is that the stone was not altered further after its initial carving. There are no signs of later modification, reuse, or incorporation into subsequent architecture. This suggests that its role, whatever it was intended to be, was either short-lived or never fully realized. The stone's location adds another layer to the question. Masuda no Iwafuna is not placed at the highest point in the landscape, nor is it aligned with a major route or settlement center. Reaching it requires intentional movement rather than passing through by chance. This placement suggests that visibility was not its primary purpose. Instead, the stone appears to have been meant for those who already knew where it was. Its significance may have been internal to a specific group, rather than public or ceremonial in a broad sense. Into early Japanese belief systems, large stones and rock formations were often associated with spiritual presence. Before the formal establishment of Shinto shrines, natural features served as focal points for ritual and reverence. Carving such a feature could represent an attempt to formalize or mark a sacred location. At the same time, the abstract geometry of Masuda no Iwafune differs from later Shinto practices, which emphasize minimal alteration of natural forms. This difference reflects the transitional nature of the Asuka period itself, when older traditions intersected with new political and religious ideas. The absence of inscriptions is notable. By the Asuka period, writing was known and used in Japan. If the stone had a purely administrative or commemorative function, one might expect textual markers. Their absence suggests that meaning was conveyed through form rather than language. Archaeological surveys around the stone have not identified associated structures, offering pits or clear activity areas. This reinforces the interpretation that interaction with the stone was limited and controlled rather than frequent or communal. Weathering patterns on the stone indicate long-term exposure, but edges remain sharp enough to confirm that erosion has been slow. This preservation allows modern observers to see the monument much as it would have appeared shortly after carving. Masuda no Iwafune does not align neatly with known categories of ancient construction. It is neither architectural nor sculptural in the conventional sense. It occupies an ambiguous space between object, marker, and intervention in the landscape. The effort invested in shaping a single stone of this size suggests importance, but the lack of contextual evidence prevents simple conclusions. Meaning here is inferred from restraint as much as from scale. The monument draws attention not by height or enclosure, but by precision and isolation. It stands apart from its surroundings without dominating them, asserting presence through form rather than location. In this way, Masuda no Iwafune reflects a moment when stone was used to express intent without explanation, relying on geometry and permanence rather than narrative or symbolism that can be easily decoded. The carved surfaces continue to define how the stone is approached and understood, shaping attention toward specific lines, planes, and voids embedded directly into the bedrock. Qumran ruins. The ruins of Qumran are located on a barren limestone plateau overlooking the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what is now the West Bank. The environment is severe. Rainfall is minimal, summer temperatures are extreme, and vegetation is sparse. From a distance, the site appears isolated and inhospitable, separated from major population centers and traditional agricultural land. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Qumran. Occupation at Qumran began around the 2nd century BCE and continued, with interruptions until the Roman destruction of the region in the 1st century CE. The ruins consist of a compact complex of stone buildings, courtyards, water installations, and industrial areas rather than a conventional town. Qumran was not designed as a city. There are no streets laid out for expansion, no market areas, and no dense residential quarters. Instead, the site reflects controlled use of space, with buildings clustered closely together and activity organized around shared facilities. One of the most prominent features of Qumran is its water system. Despite being located in an arid region, the site contains an unusually large number of cisterns, pools, and channels. These installations were carefully engineered to capture seasonal runoff from nearby wadis during brief periods of rainfall. Water was diverted through channels cut into the bedrock and directed into large plastered reservoirs. These cisterns were sealed to reduce evaporation and contamination. The scale of this system exceeds what would be expected for a small temporary settlement. Several of the pools include steps leading down into the water. These step basins are significant because they resemble ritual immersion pools, known as mikvahot, used in Jewish purification practices during the Second Temple period. Their presence suggests that water at Qumran served religious as well as practical purposes. The emphasis on controlled water access shaped daily life at the site. Use of the pools would have followed strict rules regarding timing, cleanliness, and eligibility. Architecture here reinforced discipline and routine rather than convenience. Buildings at Qumran were constructed from local stone and mud mortar. Walls are thick, and rooms are modest in size. There is little evidence of decorative architecture. The focus is on function rather than display. Excavations have identified spaces interpreted as communal rooms rather than private dwellings. Some rooms appear to have been used for shared meals or collective activity. Individual living quarters, if they existed, were limited and uniform. Industrial areas within the site include installations for pottery production, kilns, clay processing areas, and large quantities of standardized ceramic vessels have been uncovered. This suggests that pottery was produced on-site rather than imported. The pottery itself is distinctive. Many vessels are simple, undecorated, and uniform in shape. This standardization reflects controlled production rather than individual craftsmanship. Such uniformity aligns with communal living rather than household-based economies. Storage facilities are another notable feature. Long rooms containing rows of vessels suggest centralized storage of food and supplies. Access to stored goods would have been regulated rather than open. The placement of buildings indicates deliberate separation of activities. Water installations, industrial areas, and communal spaces are distinct but closely connected. Movement between them was controlled by narrow passages and defined entrances. Qumran's location was chosen carefully. While remote, it was not inaccessible. The site sits near routes connecting the Judean highlands to the Jordan Valley and Dead Sea region. This allowed controlled contact with the outside world without exposure to urban influence. Nearby caves in the surrounding cliffs add another dimension to the site. These caves were naturally formed and later used by humans. Archaeological finds from some caves include storage jars, textiles, and manuscripts. The caves are not directly integrated into the main settlement, but their proximity suggests a functional relationship. They provided secure, hidden spaces separate from daily activity areas. The most famous discoveries associated with Qumran are the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in several of these caves. While interpretation of who wrote and stored the scrolls remains debated, their presence confirms that textual activity was connected to the site. The scrolls include biblical manuscripts, legal texts, commentaries, and community rules. These texts emphasize discipline, purity, communal ownership, and separation from wider society, themes that align closely with the physical layout of Qumran. However, archaeology alone does not conclusively identify the inhabitants. While many scholars associate Qumran with a Jewish sect, often identified as the Essenes, alternative interpretations exist. Some suggest the site functioned as a manor, fortress, or industrial center at various points. The architectural evidence supports prolonged, organized occupation rather than casual use. The investment in water infrastructure, storage, and standardized production suggests planning and continuity. Qumran's fortifications are minimal. There's no massive defensive wall. Protection appears to have relied more on isolation and control of access than on military strength. The Roman destruction of the region in the mid-1st century CE brought occupation at Qumran to an end. Evidence of burning and abandonment suggests a sudden disruption rather than gradual decline. After abandonment, the site was not rebuilt on a significant scale. Its ruins remained exposed, preserving a snapshot of a highly regulated settlement shaped by ideology as much as environment. Qumran represents a way of life organized around restraint, order, and separation. Architecture here does not express power through monumentality, but through repetition, regulation, and control of resources. The relationship between buildings, water, storage, and isolation defines the character of the site more clearly than any single structure. The ruins continue to shape interpretation through their restraint, offering material evidence of a community that chose limitation over expansion and discipline over display. Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu. The Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu rises from the flat plains west of modern Baghdad, near the village of Akhar Kuf in Iraq. The surrounding landscape is broad and open, shaped by river systems, seasonal flooding, and long horizons. In antiquity, this area lay within the heartland of Mesopotamia, one of the earliest regions to support large organized states. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Dur-Kurigalzu, a city founded in the 14th century BCE by the Kassite king Kurigalzu Seqefert. The ziggurat formed the central architectural and symbolic feature of this planned capital, visible from great distances across the plain. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian cities that developed gradually, Dur-Kurigalzu was constructed as a deliberate political project. Its layout reflects centralized authority rather than organic growth. Streets, temples, administrative buildings, and defensive walls were arranged around the ziggurat, which anchored the city both physically and symbolically. The ziggurat itself was built as a massive step platform of mud brick with fired brick reinforcement. Its core consists of sun-dried bricks laid in thick courses, while outer faces were strengthened with baked bricks bonded using bitumen. This combination balanced scale with durability, allowing the structure to rise high without collapsing under its own weight. Originally, the ziggurat stood several stories tall, forming a tiered structure with sloping sides. Although erosion has reduced its height, the remaining core still dominates the landscape. The structure's verticality was intentional. In Mesopotamian belief systems, height carried meaning. Elevation brought ritual space closer to the realm of the gods. The ziggurat was not a tomb, nor was it a public gathering platform. Its primary function was religious. At its summit stood a shrine dedicated to a major deity, likely Enlil, one of the most powerful gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Access to this upper sanctuary was restricted, reserved for priests and ritual specialists. Movement up the ziggurat was carefully controlled. Stairways and ramps guided ascent along prescribed paths. This regulated movement reinforced hierarchy, separating ordinary activity at ground level from sacred space above. The construction of the ziggurat required vast resources. Clay for bricks was sourced locally from riverine deposits, shaped, dried, and fired in large quantities. Labor was organized on a state level, reflecting the administrative capacity of the Kassite kingdom. Stamped bricks bearing royal inscriptions have been found at the site. These inscriptions name Kurigalzu and record acts of construction. Unlike later monumental texts that emphasize conquest, these inscriptions focus on building and dedication, reinforcing the king's role as a mediator between gods and people. The orientation of the ziggurat follows Mesopotamian convention, aligned broadly with cardinal directions. This alignment was not decorative. It reflected a worldview in which cities mirrored cosmic order. Architecture served as a stabilizing force in a world believed to be shaped by divine will. Dur-Kurigalzu was not only a religious center, it functioned as an administrative capital. Nearby structures included palaces, storehouses, and workshops. The ziggurat stood at the center of this system, symbolizing divine sanction for political authority. The Kassites, who ruled Babylon for several centuries, were originally outsiders to southern Mesopotamia. Establishing a new capital allowed them to legitimize their rule without relying entirely on older Babylonian cities. The ziggurat played a key role in this process, anchoring Kassite power within traditional religious architecture. Water management was essential to the city's survival. Canals diverted water from the Euphrates, supporting agriculture and brick production. The stability of the ziggurat itself depended on managing moisture, as water infiltration could weaken mud brick cores. Evidence suggests that the ziggurat underwent maintenance and repair over time. Brick courses were replaced, surfaces replastered, and damaged areas reinforced. This indicates long-term use rather than short-lived construction. Despite its importance, Dur-Kurigalzu did not remain the political center of Mesopotamia indefinitely. Shifts in power and trade routes reduced its prominence. Eventually, the city was abandoned, and the ziggurat was left exposed to wind, rain, and erosion. Unlike stone monuments, mud brick structures decay gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. Over centuries, surfaces eroded, leaving the dense core visible. What remains today reflects both original design and long-term environmental exposure. The survival of the ziggurat is partly due to its scale. Smaller buildings disappeared entirely, while the massive core endured. Its presence continues to mark the site, even in ruin. Archaeological excavation at Akar Kuf has revealed not only the ziggurat, but also surrounding urban features, allowing reconstruction of how the city functioned as a whole. The ziggurat's role becomes clear when seen as part of an integrated system rather than an isolated monument. In Mesopotamian society, architecture communicated stability in an unpredictable environment. Floods, droughts, and political change were constant threats. Monumental structures like ziggurats asserted continuity through repetition and maintenance. The ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu exemplifies this approach. It was not built to be mysterious or symbolic in abstraction. It was built to function within a specific religious and political framework. Its form reflects known traditions rather than experimentation. The Kassites adopted the ziggurat form deliberately, aligning themselves with Mesopotamian religious norms, while asserting new authority through scale and placement. The structure continues to define the site's identity. Even reduced to its core, it organizes space, visibility, and movement across the plain. The ziggurat stands as a material record of how architecture was used to anchor power, belief, and administration within the Mesopotamian landscape. Nuragic sacred wells foundations. Across the island of Sardinia, beneath open fields and near ancient settlements, a distinct type of subterranean structure appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. These are known today as nuragic sacred wells, stone-built chambers constructed around natural springs and groundwater sources. Unlike surface monuments such as Nuraga towers, these wells were designed to draw attention downward, into the earth, rather than upward into the landscape. Archaeologically, these sites belong to the Nuragic civilization, which flourished on Sardinia from roughly 1800 to 500 BCE. The wells are identified as part of the Nuragic sacred wells tradition, and they represent one of the most technically refined forms of Nuragic stone construction. Sacred wells are typically composed of three main architectural elements. The first is a forecourt or entrance area, often paved and open to the sky. From this space, a narrow stone stairway descends underground. At the base of the stairs lies a circular or thalos-like chamber, built directly around a water source. The foundations of these structures are crucial to understanding how they functioned. Wells were not placed randomly. Builders identified reliable springs and then constructed stone chambers precisely aligned to capture and protect the water. The lowest stones sit directly against bedrock, forming a stable interface between architecture and geology. The stairways were built with carefully dressed stone blocks laid in consistent courses. Steps descend gradually, controlling movement and pace. This descent would have required intentional effort, reinforcing separation between the surface world and the interior chamber. At the bottom, the chamber enclosing the water is often corbelled, with stones projecting inward as they rise, forming a beehive-like dome. This technique distributes weight evenly and allows the chamber to remain stable without mortar. The water itself was the central feature. In many wells, the surface of the spring remains visible from the lowest step, reflecting light from above. This visual effect appears intentional, combining darkness, enclosure, and reflection in a controlled space. Construction quality in these foundations is remarkably consistent. Stones were cut with precision, fitted tightly, and aligned symmetrically. This level of craftsmanship suggests specialist builders rather than general labor alone. The choice to invest such effort underground is significant. These wells were not designed for everyday water extraction alone. Their architecture exceeds practical necessity. Simple access points would have sufficed for daily use, yet the Nuragic builders created formal monumental interiors. Archaeological finds associated with sacred wells include votive offerings, bronze figurines, pottery, and jewelry. These objects were deposited intentionally, often near the water source, indicating ritual use rather than domestic activity. The location of wells relative to settlements also matters. Many are situated slightly outside habitation areas, accessible but distinct. This separation suggests that visits followed specific occasions rather than routine daily trips. Orientation plays a role as well. Some sacred wells are aligned with celestial events, particularly lunar standstills. Light entering the chamber at certain times would reflect directly off the water surface. While not universal, this pattern appears often enough to suggest deliberate planning. Water in Nuragic society was more than a resource. It was a mediator between worlds, surface and underground, human and natural. By building down into the earth, the wells formalized this relationship through architecture. The foundations had to withstand constant moisture. Builders addressed this by selecting dense stone and ensuring tight joints. Drainage channels were sometimes included to manage overflow and prevent erosion. Maintenance would have been essential. Sediment removal, stone repair, and access control required ongoing attention. This implies organized community responsibility rather than sporadic use. Unlike Nurega towers, which may have served defensive or administrative roles, sacred wells were not multifunctional. Their design is singularly focused. Every element directs movement toward water. The repetition of this architectural form across Sardinia suggests shared belief, rather than isolated practice. Communities invested in similar structures even when local conditions differed, indicating cultural continuity. The foundations of these wells also reveal long-term planning. Some were rebuilt or modified over centuries, maintaining the original layout while reinforcing stonework as needed. Later cultures did not significantly alter most sacred wells. Many were sealed or left unused rather than repurposed, suggesting that their meaning did not translate easily into new belief systems. Today, excavation reveals how deeply integrated these foundations are with the surrounding geology. Removing any element disrupts the entire structure, underscoring the precision of original design. The sacred wells demonstrate that Nuragic architecture was not limited to visible power or defense. It extended into controlled interior spaces where movement, light, and water were carefully choreographed. Their foundations anchor them physically and symbolically, binding stone, groundwater, and human activity into a single enduring system that shaped how communities understood access, ritual, and place. Megalithic jars of Assam. In the hills of northeastern India, far from major river plains and imperial centers, a series of unusual stone objects has come to light. Scattered across forested slopes and remote plateaus in Assam are large carved stone jars placed deliberately within the landscape. They don't resemble domestic vessels, nor do they fit easily into known architectural traditions of the region. Archaeologically, these features are referred to as the megalithic jars of Assam. Most examples are found in the Dima Hasao district and surrounding upland areas. Their discovery is relatively recent, and research into their origin and purpose is still ongoing. The jars are carved from single blocks of stone, primarily sandstone or granite, depending on local geology. They vary in size, but many are large enough that they could not have been moved easily once completed. Some stand upright on the ground surface, while others are partially embedded or clustered in small groups. Most jars are cylindrical or slightly tapered, with thick walls and flat or gently rounded bases. Several have shallow lids or nearby stone covers, though many remain uncovered. The interior cavities are smooth, suggesting careful hollowing rather than rough excavation. No inscriptions or decorative carvings have been identified on the jars. Their surfaces are plain, with tool marks indicating controlled carving rather than natural erosion. This simplicity makes interpretation dependent on context rather than iconography. The placement of the jars is one of their most significant features. They are not associated with permanent settlements, agricultural terraces, or known habitation sites. Instead, they appear in liminal spaces, hilltops, forest clearings, and elevated ridges, locations that require deliberate travel. Excavation around some jars has revealed limited material remains. In a few cases, fragments of pottery, charcoal, or stone tools have been found nearby, but not in quantities that would indicate domestic use. Human remains have not been consistently identified, leaving burial interpretation uncertain. Comparisons are often made with the famous stone jar sites of Laos. While the forms are broadly similar, there is currently no evidence of direct cultural connection. The Assam jars appear to represent an independent tradition rather than an extension of Southeast Asian practices. Dating the jars has proven difficult. Without organic material directly associated with their placement, estimates rely on indirect evidence. Most scholars tentatively place them within a broad prehistoric or early historic time frame, possibly between the first millennium BCE and the early centuries CE. The labor involved in producing these jars would have been substantial. Stone had to be quarried, shaped externally, and then hollowed from the top. This process required planning, skilled workmanship, and time. The effort suggests that the jars served a purpose, considered important enough to justify such investment. One interpretation proposes that the jars were used in funerary practices, possibly for secondary burial. In several cultures, bodies were first exposed or buried temporarily. Then bones were later collected and placed into containers. The size and form of the jars could accommodate such use, though direct evidence remains limited. Another possibility is that the jars functioned as storage vessels for ritual offerings, grain, or liquids. However, their placement away from settlements makes everyday storage unlikely. Any contents would have required intentional transport to these locations. Local oral traditions provide limited clues. Some communities associate the jars with ancestors or legendary figures, but these stories cannot be securely linked to the time of construction. Still, they indicate that the jars have long been recognized as meaningful features in the landscape. The jar's visibility varies. Some are exposed, in open clearings, while others are partially hidden by vegetation. This uneven exposure may result from environmental change rather than original intention. Forest cover in the region has shifted significantly over centuries. The absence of enclosing structures or platforms suggests that the jars themselves were the focal point. There's no evidence of walls, markers, or alignments that would formalize the sites architecturally. This simplicity places emphasis on repetition rather than monumentality. Meaning may have emerged through the act of placing jars in specific locations, rather than through elaborate construction. The choice of upland areas is notable. These locations offer wide views and separation from daily activity. In many cultures, such spaces are associated with transition, memory, or ritual rather than habitation. Archaeological investigation has been limited by terrain and access. Many sites remain undocumented, and the full distribution of jars is likely larger than currently recorded. This incomplete picture complicates interpretation. What can be said with confidence is that the jars were intentionally made and intentionally placed. They were not accidental products of quarrying or natural formation. Their makers chose stone as a durable medium, ensuring that the jars would persist long after their original use ended. This choice aligns with practices seen in other megalithic traditions where permanence carried social or symbolic value. The megalithic jars of Assam challenge assumptions about prehistoric complexity in the region. They indicate organized labor, shared practices, and landscape-scale planning outside of urban or state-based systems. Rather than forming part of a visible architectural complex, the jars function as quiet markers embedded within terrain. Their significance lies not in scale or decoration, but in repetition, placement, and endurance. The jars remain where they were placed, continuing to define small pockets of landscape through their presence alone. Bighorn Medicine Wheel. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel is located high in the Bighorn Mountains of northern Wyoming. At an elevation of over 2,900 meters, the surrounding landscape is defined by open alpine terrain, long sight lines, and extreme seasonal weather. Snow can persist well into summer, and access is limited for much of the year. This setting immediately distinguishes the site from everyday habitation. Archaeologically, the monument is identified as the Bighorn Medicine Wheel. It consists of a large circular arrangement of stones, approximately 25 meters in diameter, with a central cairn connected to the outer ring by stone spokes. Additional cairns are positioned along the perimeter. The wheel is constructed entirely from locally sourced stone. No mortar or shaping was used. Stones were selected, carried, and placed deliberately, forming a clear geometric pattern that contrasts with the otherwise irregular alpine ground. The structure's form is simple but intentional. A central cairn anchors the design. From this point, lines of stones radiate outward like spokes, terminating at the outer circle. Along this perimeter, several cairns interrupt the ring at specific points. The site was not built in a single event. Archaeological evidence suggests multiple construction phases, with additions and adjustments made over long periods. Some components appear older than others, indicating continued use and modification rather than one-time creation. Dating the Bighorn medicine wheel precisely is difficult. Organic material is scarce at this altitude, and stone itself cannot be directly dated. Most estimates place its use between roughly 500 and 1,500 years ago, though some components may be older. The location of the wheel is central to its interpretation. From this high vantage point, the horizon is unobstructed in multiple directions. This allows clear observation of the sun's movement across the sky throughout the year. Several researchers have noted alignments between certain spokes or cairns and astronomical events, including the summer solstice sunrise and the heliacal rising of specific stars. These alignments are not universal across all components, but patterns suggest intentional observation rather than coincidence. However, the wheel cannot be reduced to an astronomical instrument alone. In indigenous plains cultures, such structures served multiple roles simultaneously. Stone circles functioned as places of ceremony, teaching, healing, and seasonal gathering. The term medicine wheel reflects indigenous concepts of balance, relationship, and order rather than literal medicine. In many traditions, the circle represents the interconnectedness of life, the cycles of time, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Bighorn medicine wheel's elevated location suggests that journeys to the site were intentional and infrequent. Visiting required preparation, effort, and timing. This reinforces the interpretation of the wheel as a ceremonial destination rather than a casual meeting place. Unlike permanent settlements, the wheel shows no evidence of domestic activity. There are no hearths, storage pits, or refuse deposits. Activity here was episodic and purposeful. The construction method emphasizes visibility and clarity. Stones are placed to define lines and boundaries that can be read from above or from the center. Movement within the wheel would have followed these lines rather than crossing them randomly. The central cairn functions as a focal point. From this position, the spokes extend outward, linking center to horizon. This spatial arrangement reflects a worldview organized around relationships rather than enclosure. Additional cairns on the perimeter appear to mark specific directions or points of significance. Their placement varies slightly, suggesting adaptation rather than strict standardization. The wheel's design does not impose dominance over the landscape. It does not rise high above the ground. Instead, it integrates with the terrain, becoming visible primarily through pattern rather than mass. This approach contrasts with monumental architecture in agricultural or urban societies. Here, meaning is expressed through placement and alignment rather than vertical scale. Oral traditions associated with the Bighorn medicine wheel vary among indigenous nations. Some view it as a place of vision quests, others as a teaching site or a marker of seasonal change. These traditions emphasize continuity of use rather than a single original purpose. Importantly, the wheel continues to hold cultural significance today. It's not simply an archaeological site, but a living place of meaning for indigenous communities. Modern access to the site is regulated to protect both its physical integrity and its cultural importance. This reflects recognition that the wheel's value lies in its continued presence rather than excavation or alteration. Environmental exposure has affected the structure over time. Stones have shifted due to frost heave, wind, and snowmelt. Despite this, the overall pattern remains legible, indicating resilient design. The choice to build with unmodified stone reflects a respect for material as found. The builders shape meaning through arrangement rather than transformation. The Bighorn medicine wheel demonstrates that complex spatial concepts can be expressed without permanent architecture or written record. Knowledge was embedded in landscape and movement rather than in walls or texts. The site's endurance depends on repetition of practice rather than physical reinforcement. Each visit, alignment, and ceremony renewed its significance. Rather than serving a single function, the wheel accommodated multiple layers of meaning, astronomical, ceremonial, educational, and social, without fixing any one interpretation permanently. Its presence continues to define a specific point, in the mountains where observation, movement, and relationship converge. Los Millares Fortifications. Los Millares is located in southeastern Spain, near the Andarax River in the province of Almería. The site occupies a low plateau overlooking a dry valley, positioned between coastal plains and interior uplands. This region experiences limited rainfall and strong seasonal contrasts. conditions that shaped how early communities organized settlement and defense. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Los Malares. It dates primarily to the Copper Age, roughly between 3200 and 2300 BCE, a period marked by early metallurgy, population growth, and increasing social differentiation across Iberia. Los Malares is best known for its extensive defensive system. Unlike earlier Neolithic villages that relied mainly on location for protection, Los Malares was deliberately fortified. Multiple concentric stone walls encircle the settlement, reinforced with bastions, towers, and controlled gateways. The outermost wall follows the natural contours of the plateau, forming a broad defensive perimeter. Inside this, additional walls create layered zones of access. Movement into the settlement was not direct. Approaches were narrowed, redirected, and exposed, increasing control over entry. The walls were built using locally sourced stone, stacked in dry masonry without mortar. Their thickness and height varied depending on position, with stronger reinforcement at likely points of approach. Towers projecting outward allowed defenders to observe and control surrounding ground. The presence of multiple walls suggests that defense was a primary concern rather than a secondary precaution. This level of fortification implies organized conflict, or at least sustained fear of attack. Architecture here reflects anticipation rather than reaction. Inside the fortification, space was carefully managed. Domestic structures were densely arranged, with narrow pathways connecting living areas, storage spaces, and communal zones. Expansion outward was limited by the walls, reinforcing inward organization. Beyond the main settlement, hundreds of tombs are distributed across the surrounding landscape. These are primarily Tholos-style burial chambers, built with stone walls and corbelled roofs. Their number indicates a large, long-lived population rather than a small elite enclave. The relationship between the fortifications and the burial areas is significant. The dead were placed outside the defensive walls, creating a clear separation between living space and mortuary landscape. This division reflects structured social boundaries. The fortifications also relate to resource control. Los Millares sits near routes connecting the coast with mineral-rich interior zones. Copper ores in the surrounding region were exploited during this period, and control over production and exchange would have increased competition. Evidence of metallurgy at the site includes slag, crucibles, and copper tools. While not industrial in scale, this activity marks an important transition in technology. The emergence of metal tools coincides with increased emphasis on defense. The fortification system was not static. Archaeological evidence shows phases of construction, repair, and reinforcement. Walls were thickened, entrances modified, and towers rebuilt over time. This indicates ongoing concern rather than a one-time response. Defensive architecture at Los Malares was integrated with natural features. Steep slopes and river valleys were incorporated into the design, reducing the need for uniform wall strength across all sides. The main entrances were particularly complex. Narrow corridors, offset gates, and restricted sightlines forced entrants to slow down and expose themselves. These features demonstrate tactical thinking rather than symbolic enclosure. Life within the walls would have been shaped by this architecture. Movement was constrained, visibility limited, and access regulated. The settlement functioned as a controlled space rather than an open village. Despite the emphasis on defense, Los Millares was not purely militarized. Domestic life continued within the walls, supported by agriculture, herding, and craft production. The fortifications framed daily activity rather than replacing it. The scale of construction required coordinated labor beyond individual households. Building and maintaining walls demanded communal effort and leadership capable of organizing work across seasons. This organization suggests emerging social hierarchy. While clear evidence of centralized rulers is limited, the ability to mobilize labor points toward structured authority. Los Malares stands out within Copper Age Europe for the sophistication of its defensive planning. Few contemporary sites show comparable investment in fortification at this scale. The settlement's eventual abandonment around the late 3rd millennium BCE remains debated. Environmental stress, social change, or shifting trade networks may have played a role. When occupation ended, the walls remained as defining features of the landscape. Over time, erosion and stone robbing reduced their height, but the layout remains legible. The fortifications continue to shape how the site is understood and explored. Los Malares demonstrates an early moment when architecture was used explicitly to manage threat, access, and territory, rather than simply shelter. The walls express a social reality in which security, resource control, and community boundaries were central concerns. Rather than monumental display, the fortifications emphasize function, repetition, and coverage, embedding protection directly into the settlement's form. They stand as evidence of how early societies responded to increasing complexity by reshaping space itself. Bryn Celli Dydw Passage Tomb. Bryn Celli Dydw is located on the island of Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales. The surrounding landscape is low and open, shaped by rolling ground, shallow soils, and exposure to Atlantic weather. From this setting, the monument does not dominate through height or mass. Its presence is subtle, revealed through approach rather than distance. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Bryn Celli Dydw. The monument dates to the late Neolithic period, around 3000 BCE. It belongs to a broader tradition of passage tombs found across the British Isles, yet it differs in layout and treatment from many of its contemporaries. The structure consists of a stone-built passage leading into a circular burial chamber, originally covered by an earthen mound. Today, the mound has been partially reconstructed, allowing the underlying stone architecture to be clearly observed. The passage is straight and narrow, directing movement along a single axis toward the interior. Construction materials were sourced locally. Upright stones form the walls of the passage and chamber, while capstones span across them to create a roof. The stones are large but not oversized, chosen for stability rather than spectacle. Their placement emphasizes balance and alignment over scale. The passage at Bryn Celli Dydw is carefully oriented. It aligns with the rising sun at the summer solstice. On that day, sunlight enters the passage and reaches into the chamber, briefly illuminating the interior space. This alignment is precise and intentional, requiring knowledge of seasonal solar movement. Such alignments were not decorative. They structured time and ritual. The passage became active only at particular moments of the year, linking architectural space with cyclical change in the natural world. Inside the chamber stands a single carved stone pillar. This stone is unusual among British passage tombs. It is decorated with spiral and serpentine patterns carved into its surface. These motifs are abstract, repetitive, and without direct representational imagery. The presence of this carved pillar suggests that the chamber was more than a repository for remains. It functioned as a focal space where visual symbolism mattered. The carvings would have been visible only in limited light, reinforcing controlled access and selective experience. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site underwent multiple phases of use. An earlier henge monument appears to have existed on the same location before the passage tomb was constructed. Stones from the earlier structure were incorporated into the later monument rather than removed entirely. This reuse indicates continuity rather than replacement. The site retained significance across generations, even as architectural form changed. Builders adapted what was already present rather than starting anew. Burial evidence from Bryn Celli Dydw is limited. Cremated remains and small artifacts have been recovered, but not in large quantities. This suggests that the monument was not used for frequent or mass burial. Instead, the tomb may have been reserved for specific individuals or for occasional ritual deposition. The architecture supports this interpretation. Movement through the passage is slow and restricted, limiting the number of people who could enter at one time. The surrounding area contains traces of stone circles and standing stones, indicating that Bryn Celli Dydw was part of a broader ceremonial landscape. The tomb was not isolated, but connected to other ritual markers through proximity and alignment. Approach to the monument would have been deliberate. The low mound conceals the chamber from view until close, emphasizing transition rather than immediate visibility. This controlled reveal mirrors the interior experience of moving from light into darkness. The chamber itself is compact. Standing upright inside is possible only near the center. This constraint encourages stillness rather than movement, reinforcing the sense of enclosure. The materials and methods used reflect Neolithic building practices focused on durability and repetition. Stones were set carefully, but without mortar. Stability depended on placement and weight distribution rather than bonding. Maintenance of the monument would have been minimal once construction was complete. The mound protected the stonework from weather, preserving interior conditions across long periods. The carved pillar remains one of the most debated elements of the site. Its abstract patterns resemble motifs found in other Neolithic contexts, particularly in Ireland, suggesting shared symbolic language across regions. However, Bryn Celli Dadu does not replicate Irish Passage tomb design exactly. Its scale, internal layout, and integration of earlier structures indicate local adaptation rather than direct imitation. The choice to align the passage with the summer solstice rather than the winter solstice also distinguishes it from many other passage tombs. This suggests variation in ritual emphasis rather than uniform belief. The monument's continued use and modification imply that its meaning was not fixed. Interpretation and practice likely evolved over time, responding to social and environmental change. The limited number of artifacts suggests that activity here was episodic rather than constant. Visits may have coincided with specific seasonal or communal events. Bryn Celli Dadu demonstrates how Neolithic architecture combined movement, light, and enclosure to shape experience. Meaning was produced through timing and access rather than through permanent display. The monument anchors its landscape quietly. Its influence emerges through alignment, repetition, and continued presence rather than through scale. The passage tomb remains a record of how space, time, and stone were brought together to structure ritual attention in a controlled and deliberate way. Balnúaran of Clava. Balnúaran of Clava lies east of Inverness in the Scottish Highlands, set on a low terrace overlooking the River Nairn. The surrounding landscape is open and gently sloping, with distant hills forming a wide horizon. Seasonal light changes here are pronounced, especially in winter, when days are short and the sun remains low in the sky. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Balnúaran of Clava, part of the wider Clava Cairns complex. The monuments date to around 2500–2000 BCE, placing them in the early Bronze Age. Balnúaran consists of 3 principal cairns, aligned along a southwest-northeast axis, accompanied by stone circles and standing stones. The 3 cairns are not identical. 2 are passage cairns, while the third is a ring cairn. Each is surrounded by a circle of standing stones, creating layered zones of movement and enclosure. These elements were designed as a single composition rather than independent structures. The passage cairns are built with stone-lined corridors leading into small circular chambers. The passages are short and narrow, constructed from upright slabs capped by lintels. Access is controlled, limiting both movement and visibility as one approaches the interior. The most significant architectural feature of Balnúaran is orientation. The passages of the 2 passage cairns align with the setting sun at the winter solstice. On that day, sunlight enters the passage and reaches the back wall of the chamber, briefly illuminating the interior before fading. This alignment is deliberate and precise. It required careful observation of the solar cycle and accurate placement of stone. The winter solstice, marking the shortest day of the year, would have carried strong symbolic meaning, associated with renewal and the return of light. The surrounding stone circles reinforce this focus. Standing stones vary in height and shape, arranged so that the tallest stones are positioned to the southwest and the shortest to the northeast. This gradient mirrors the path of the sun, emphasizing direction and movement rather than symmetry. Stone selection appears intentional. Many of the standing stones are split slabs, placed with their flatter faces oriented inward toward the cairns. Their surfaces are not decorated, but their form contributes to the visual and spatial experience. The cairns themselves were originally covered in curbstones, forming a circular boundary at ground level. These curbstones create a clear edge between interior sacred space and the surrounding landscape. Excavation has revealed limited burial evidence. Cremated human remains were found within the chambers, but in small quantities. This suggests that the cairns were not used for frequent burial, but for selected individuals or specific events. The presence of cremation rather than inhumation reflects broader changes in Bronze Age funerary practice. Fire transformed the body before deposition, altering the relationship between remains and monument. The ring cairn at Balnúaran lacks a passage and chamber. Instead, it consists of a circular stone bank, enclosing an open interior. Its function differs from the passage cairns, yet its placement within the same alignment suggests a complementary role. Together, the 3 cairns form a structured ceremonial space, rather than a burial ground alone. Movement between them would have followed deliberate paths, guided by stone circles and open ground. The site's placement near the river is significant. Rivers often mark boundaries and routes of movement. The cairns overlook this corridor without sitting directly upon it, maintaining separation while retaining visibility. Balnúaran was not an isolated monument. The surrounding region contains additional cairns, standing stones, and later burial sites. This density indicates long-term ritual significance of the landscape. Construction required coordinated labor. Stones were quarried locally and transported short distances. While individual stones are not massive, the cumulative effort reflects communal organization. The cairns were built to endure. Dry stone construction and careful weight distribution ensured stability over millennia. Despite partial collapse and later disturbance, the essential layout remains legible. Later activity at the site was limited. Unlike some monuments that were reused or modified extensively, Balnuaran appears to have been respected and left largely intact after its primary period of use. The emphasis on winter alignment distinguishes Balnuaran from many Neolithic passage tombs, which often focus on sunrise or summer events. This shift suggests changing ritual priorities in the Bronze Age. The architecture does not invite large gatherings within the chambers. Instead, it frames selective moments when light, space, and time converge briefly. The cairns create a rhythm of approach, pause, and withdrawal. Movement slows as one enters the passage, stops at the chamber, and reverses outward into open space. This controlled sequence emphasizes experience rather than spectacle. Meaning arises through timing and placement, not through decoration or scale. Balnuaran of Clava demonstrates how Bronze Age communities use stone to organize attention towards specific moments in the year. Embedding cyclical time into the landscape, the monuments remain fixed within their setting, continuing to register light, shadow, and alignment much as they did when first constructed. Hagar Kim Temples. The Hagar Kim Temples stand on a limestone ridge overlooking the Mediterranean Sea on the southern coast of Malta. The terrain here is exposed and open, shaped by wind, salt air, and long views toward the horizon. From this elevated position, the temples are visible from a distance, yet their scale becomes clear only when approached on foot. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Hagar Kim. Construction began around 3600 BCE, placing Hagar Kim among the earliest known freestanding stone temple complexes in the world. These structures predate Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by many centuries. The temples were built by Malta's Neolithic farming communities, who lived on a small, resource-limited island. This context makes the scale of construction significant. Limestone blocks weighing several tons were quarried, transported, and set into place without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. Hagar Kim is composed of a series of interconnected chambers arranged around a central axis. The walls are formed from large upright stones, with smaller stones filling gaps between them. Roofs were likely made from corbelled stone or timber elements, now lost. The plan of the temple is organic rather than geometric. Curved walls create apses that open into one another, producing enclosed interior spaces with no straight corridors. Movement through the complex is gradual, guided by narrowing entrances and changing light. The main entrance is marked by a monumental trilithon, two upright stones supporting a horizontal lintel. Passing through this threshold shifts the visitor from open landscape into controlled interior space. This transition is central to how the temple functions. Inside, chambers vary in size and height. Some spaces are broad and open, while others are constricted and intimate. This variation suggests that different areas serve different purposes, possibly related to stages of ritual activity. Stone altars, niches, and carved features are present within the complex. These elements indicate deliberate placement of objects or offerings rather than random use. The absence of domestic features such as hearths or storage pits reinforces the interpretation of the site as ceremonial. The limestone used at Hagar Kim is soft when freshly quarried, allowing shaping with stone tools, but hardens over time when exposed to air. This property made it suitable for carving and long-term stability, though it is vulnerable to erosion. Decoration at Hagar Kim is limited but intentional. Some stones bear shallow carvings, including spiral motifs and pitted surfaces. These markings are subtle, visible only at close range, reinforcing the inward-focused nature of the architecture. The temples show evidence of astronomical awareness. The main axis aligns broadly with the rising sun at certain times of year. Light entering the temple changes seasonally, illuminating specific stones and surfaces. Nearby, the Menajra temples form part of the same ritual landscape, with more precise solar alignments. Together, these sites suggest that observation of celestial cycles played a role in how ritual time was structured. The builders of Hagar Kim left no written records. Interpretation relies on architecture, artifact distribution, and comparative study. What emerges is a society that invested heavily in communal ritual space rather than defensive or residential architecture. Burial was not the primary function of Hagar Chim. Unlike passage tombs, human remains are rare and incidental. The emphasis is on gathering, offering, and repeated visitation rather than interment. The temples were used and modified over centuries. Walls were reinforced, entrances altered, and features added or removed. This indicates long-term relevance rather than a brief period of use. Eventually, the temples were abandoned. Environmental degradation, soil exhaustion, or social change may have contributed to the decline of Malta's Neolithic population. When use ended, the structures remained exposed to the elements. Over time, erosion damaged surfaces and destabilized stones. Modern conservation efforts have introduced protective coverings to slow deterioration, highlighting the fragility of the material despite its age. Hagar Kim's architecture does not emphasize vertical dominance. Instead, it draws attention inward, toward enclosed space and controlled movement. Meaning is produced through proximity and sequence rather than spectacle. The absence of overt hierarchy in the layout suggests communal participation rather than elite control. Access appears regulated, but not exclusive. The site's coastal location adds another layer of interpretation. The sea was a constant presence, shaping climate, resources, and worldview. The temples face this horizon, integrating land, sky, and water into a single setting. Hagar Chim demonstrates how early societies used stone to shape experience rather than impose authority. Architecture here frames action, timing, and attention without overt symbols of power. The temples remain embedded in their landscape, continuing to register light, wind, and seasonal change, much as they did thousands of years ago. Bandiagara Escarpment Structures. The Bandiagara Escarpment stretches for more than 150 kilometers across central Mali, forming a dramatic sandstone cliff that rises sharply above the surrounding plains. The escarpment creates a natural boundary between ecological zones, with sheer rock faces, narrow ledges, and elevated plateaus shaping how people have lived in this region for centuries. Archaeologically, the area is identified as the Bandiagara Escarpment. It is best known for the dense concentration of structures built directly into the cliff face and along its base. These include dwellings, granaries, storage rooms, and ritual spaces positioned in places that are difficult to reach and carefully selected. The earliest structures visible today are associated with the Telam people, a group who occupied the escarpment before the arrival of the Dogon, likely between the 11th and 16th centuries CE. The Telam built small stone and mud structures high up in the cliff, often in locations that appear inaccessible without climbing equipment. These cliff structures are compact and uniform. Many consist of small rectangular rooms with narrow openings. Their placement suggests deliberate avoidance of the valley floor, favoring elevation and concealment over ease of access. Granaries are among the most common structures attributed to the Telam. Built with thick walls and minimal openings, they were designed to protect stored grain from moisture, pests, and theft. Their elevated positions further reduced risk, making access possible only through controlled climbing routes. Construction materials were sourced locally. Sandstone blocks were cut or shaped minimally, combined with mud plaster to seal gaps. Wooden beams supported roofs or upper elements, though most organic materials have not survived. The scale of individual structures is modest, but their number and distribution indicate long-term occupation rather than temporary refuge. The Telam invested significant effort in shaping a vertical landscape into a functional living environment. Sometime after the Telam period, Dogon communities settled along the base of the escarpment and on accessible ledges. Rather than abandoning earlier structures, they incorporated the escarpment into a new pattern of settlement. Dogon villages are typically located at the foot of the cliffs, where access to arable land and water is easier. However, important ritual and storage structures remain positioned higher up, maintaining a vertical relationship between daily life and sacred or protected space. Dogon architecture uses similar materials but differs in organization. Houses, granaries, and shrines are arranged according to social rules and cosmological principles rather than defensive necessity alone. The escarpment itself functions as an organizing feature. It shelters villages from wind, moderates temperature, and provides stone for construction. It also acts as a visual and symbolic backdrop to community life. Movement between levels of the escarpment is deliberate. Paths are narrow, steep, and often indirect. This controlled movement reinforces separation between spaces used for different purposes. Some cliff structures were used for burial. Skeletal remains and artifacts found in elevated chambers suggest funerary practices that place the dead apart from the living. These locations limited disturbance and emphasized transition rather than permanence. The difficulty of access also reduced reuse. Once placed, structures high in the cliff were rarely modified. This preservation has allowed archaeologists to study construction methods with minimal later interference. The escarpment's environment influenced architectural choices. Seasonal rains can be intense, but runoff flows quickly down the cliff face rather than pooling. Structures built into natural recesses benefit from this drainage. Wind erosion shapes exposed surfaces, but recessed buildings remain relatively protected. Builders selected locations that balance visibility, protection, and stability. There's no evidence of large-scale fortification. Defense appears to have relied on elevation and concealment rather than walls or towers. The landscape itself served as the primary barrier. The relationship between the Telem and Dogon is complex. Oral traditions describe the Telem as earlier inhabitants who disappeared or moved away. Archaeology suggests gradual transition rather than sudden displacement. Dogon communities did not erase earlier structures. Instead, they reinterpreted them, assigning new meanings and stories to the cliff dwellings. The escarpment became a layered landscape of memory rather than a single-period site. Ritual use of space remains important today. Certain caves and ledges are still considered restricted, associated with ancestral presence or ceremonial practice. The Bandyagar escarpment is not a single monument. It is an extended architectural system shaped by geology, climate, and social organization over many generations. Rather than imposing architecture onto the land, communities here worked within existing forms, adapting to vertical constraints rather than reshaping them. The structures demonstrate a different approach to permanence. Buildings were placed where they could endure through inaccessibility rather than mass or reinforcement. Visibility plays a dual role. From below, cliff structures are visible reminders of presence. From above or within, they offer wide views across the plain, connecting settlement with territory. The escarpment organizes space vertically, separating storage, ritual, burial, and habitation without enclosing them within walls. This spatial logic reflects a worldview in which elevation, distance, and difficulty of access carried meaning alongside practical function. Sacsayhuaman Hidden Terraces Sacsayhuaman occupies a high ridge above the city of Cusco, overlooking the valley from an elevated position that commands long views in every direction. The site sits at more than 3,700 meters above sea level, within a landscape shaped by steep slopes, seasonal rains, and seismic activity. From below, Sacsayhuaman is most often recognized by its massive zigzag stone walls. Less visible, but equally important, are the terraces built into and around the hill itself. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Sacsayhuaman, though the term fortress only partially describes its function. Construction began during the Inca period in the 15th century CE, as Cusco developed into the political and ceremonial center of a rapidly expanding empire. Sacsayhuaman formed part of a larger urban and ritual landscape rather than standing apart from it. The terraces at Sacsayhuaman are not immediately obvious as separate architectural features. They are integrated into the hillside, supporting the massive walls above while stabilizing the slope below. These terraces extend laterally across the ridge, creating step platforms that manage elevation rather than flatten it. Their primary function was structural. The weight of the monumental stone walls required reinforcement. Terraces acted as retaining systems, distributing load and preventing landslides. In a region prone to earthquakes, this layered approach increased resilience. The stones used in terrace construction differ from the iconic polygonal blocks of the upper walls. Terrace stones are smaller, more regularly shaped, and fitted tightly without mortar. This contrast reflects functional differentiation within the same site. The terraces also played a role in water management. Channels carved into stone directed rainwater away from walls and down controlled paths. Without such systems, runoff would have eroded foundations and destabilized the structure over time. These drainage features are subtle. They do not draw attention, but they are essential. Water flows were anticipated and guided, ensuring that heavy seasonal rains did not undermine the site. Beyond structural and hydraulic functions, the terraces created usable space. Some served as pathways, others as platforms for movement or assembly. Their stepped arrangement controlled circulation up and down the hill. Archaeological evidence suggests that not all terraces were accessible to everyone. Certain routes were narrow and indirect, indicating controlled movement rather than open access. This reflects the Inca practice of regulating space according to social role and activity. Sacsayhuaman's terraces also connect the site to the surrounding landscape. They align with natural contours rather than cutting across them. This approach reflects Inca architectural principles, which emphasize working with terrain rather than reshaping it completely. The limestone used in construction was quarried locally. Transporting stone uphill required coordinated labor organized through the Inca system of state obligation. The scale of this effort indicates centralized planning rather than local initiative alone. Unlike agricultural terraces found elsewhere in the Andes, those at Sacsayhuaman were not primarily for cultivation. Soil depth is limited, and there is little evidence of planting. Their purpose was architectural and organizational rather than productive. The terraces form transitional zones between the monumental core of Sacsayhuaman and the open slopes below. This gradation softens the boundary between built and natural space, reducing visual and physical abruptness. From certain angles, the terraces are barely visible, blending into the hillside. From others, they define the rhythm of the slope. This shifting visibility reflects intentional design rather than accidental placement. The terraces also contributed to defense, though indirectly, by controlling approach routes and limiting direct descent. They made movement predictable. Combined with the upper walls, this created layered control rather than a single defensive line. However, defense alone does not explain their extent. The terraces are too carefully integrated and widespread to be purely military. They reflect a broader concern with stability, order, and long-term endurance. Maintenance of these terraces would have been ongoing. Stones shift over time, drainage channels clog, and surfaces erode. The Inca state invested in upkeep, suggesting that the site remained important throughout its use. After the Spanish conquest, parts of Sacsayhuaman were dismantled. Stones were removed for construction in Cusco. The terraces, less visible and less reusable, remained largely intact. This partial survival has shaped modern perception. Attention often focuses on the walls, while the terraces remain underappreciated despite their essential role. Archaeological surveys show that the terraces form a coherent system rather than isolated features. They work together to support, protect, and organize the entire complex. The hidden nature of these terraces reflects a broader pattern in Inca architecture. Some of the most critical elements were not designed to impress visually, but to function reliably over time. Their success is measured not by visibility, but by endurance. Despite earthquakes, weather, and centuries of neglect, the terraces continued to stabilize the slope. Sacsayhuaman's hidden terraces demonstrate how large-scale Inca construction depended on layered solutions rather than singular monumental acts. They reveal a philosophy in which architecture extended beyond walls and buildings, embedding itself into terrain through gradual transitions. These terraces remain fixed within the hillside, quietly supporting the more visible elements above, shaping movement, drainage, and stability without drawing attention to themselves. Baalbek Trilithons. Baalbek is located in the Bekaa Valley of eastern Lebanon, a broad fertile corridor framed by the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. The valley has long served as a route connecting the Mediterranean coast with inland regions of Syria and Mesopotamia. This position made Baalbek a natural center for settlement, exchange, and later monumental construction. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Baalbek, known in Roman times as Heliopolis. While Baalbek is most widely recognized for its Roman temples, the massive stone blocks known as the Trilithons form part of the platform on which the Temple of Jupiter was built. These stones are among the largest ever used in ancient construction. The Trilithons consist of 3 enormous limestone blocks set horizontally within the retaining wall of the temple's podium. Each block measures approximately 19 meters in length, 4 meters in height, and over 3 meters in depth, with estimated weights approaching 800 tons. Their size alone distinguishes them from surrounding masonry. These stones are positioned with remarkable precision. They are aligned evenly, placed at the same elevation, and fitted tightly against adjacent blocks. Despite their scale, the joints between them are narrow and consistent, indicating careful preparation and placement. The trilithons are not freestanding monuments. They form part of a larger foundation system, integrated into a multi-layered podium that supports the Roman temple above. Understanding them requires viewing the platform as a whole, rather than isolating the stones themselves. The podium consists of at least two construction phases. An earlier megalithic foundation layer underlies a later Roman superstructure. The trilithons belong to the upper part of this foundation system, but differ in scale from both the smaller stones below and the Roman masonry above. This variation has led to long-standing debate about construction sequence. Some researchers argue that the entire platform was built during the Roman period, using imperial resources and engineering. Others suggest that elements of the foundation may predate Roman occupation and were incorporated into later building. What is certain is that the limestone used for the trilithons was quarried locally. Just a short distance from the temple lies an ancient quarry containing several massive blocks, including the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and even larger unfinished stones. These blocks demonstrate that stones of comparable or greater size were successfully extracted. The quarry provides crucial context. It shows that ancient builders had both the intention and the technical ability to work stone on this scale. The challenge lies not in quarrying alone, but in transport and placement. Transporting blocks weighing hundreds of tons required coordinated labor, prepared roadbeds, rollers or sled systems, and careful control of movement, while ancient sources describe large-scale stone transport elsewhere in the Roman world. Baalbek represents an extreme example. The placement of the trilithons at height within the podium adds another layer of complexity. The stones were not simply dragged into position at ground level. They had to be raised and aligned precisely within an already substantial structure. Roman engineering knowledge included cranes, lifting towers, and compound pulley systems capable of handling heavy loads. Whether these systems could manage stones of this size remains debated, but the Romans routinely moved large architectural elements under controlled conditions. The orientation and layout of the podium align with Roman architectural norms. The Temple of Jupiter followed a canonical plan, with the platform serving as a monumental base that elevated the sacred space above the surrounding city. Elevation carried symbolic weight. Raising the temple physically separated sacred activity from everyday life, reinforcing hierarchy and authority. The massive foundation emphasized permanence and stability. The trilithons contribute to this effect. They are largely invisible from above, hidden behind the temple's superstructure. Their purpose was not visual display, but structural reinforcement. This invisibility is important. The stones were not meant to be seen or admired individually. They functioned as load-bearing elements, distributing weight and stabilizing the platform across a wide span. Their use suggests over-engineering rather than minimal necessity. Smaller blocks could have achieved structural stability. Choosing stones of such size implies a desire for exceptional durability or symbolic emphasis embedded in construction itself. Baalbek's temples were dedicated to Jupiter, Bacchus, and Venus, reflecting Roman religious practice layered onto an older local cult tradition. The site's sacred role predates Roman control, though earlier architectural remains are limited. The Romans often built monumental temples atop earlier sacred sites, integrating local tradition into imperial form. At Baalbek, the scale of construction far exceeded regional norms, reflecting imperial ambition. Maintenance of the podium would have been essential. Earthquakes affect the Bekaa Valley, and Baalbek has experienced seismic events throughout history. The massive foundation likely contributed to the temple's survival despite damage elsewhere. After antiquity, Baalbek's stones were reused, quarried, and dismantled for other construction. The trilithons remained largely intact due to their size and inaccessibility. Their survival has shaped modern fascination with the site. Attention often focuses on how they were moved rather than why they were used. Yet their role within a coherent architectural system is clear. The trilithons were not isolated feats. They formed part of a planned monumental landscape, designed to express order, authority, and endurance through material scale. Their presence anchors the temple complex physically and conceptually, embedding Roman religious architecture into the valley through sheer mass rather than decorative excess. Understanding the Baalbek trilithons requires moving beyond questions of mystery toward analysis of engineering choice, resource availability, and architectural intent. They represent a moment when builders chose scale as a solution, committing immense effort to ensure stability and permanence within a sacred context. The stones remain fixed in place, continuing to support the structure above them and shape interpretation below, long after the society that placed them has passed. Tomb of the Giants, Li Mizzani. The Tomb of the Giants, known as Li Mizzani, is located in northern Sardinia, near Arzachena, within a landscape shaped by granite outcrops, shallow soils, and open Mediterranean scrubland. The terrain here is uneven and exposed, offering long views but limited shelter. Within this setting, stone monuments stand out clearly, not through height, but through deliberate placement. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Li Mizzani, part of a broader funerary tradition associated with the Nuragic civilization. These tombs date primarily to the Bronze Age, beginning around the 18th century BCE, and are found across much of Sardinia. Li Mizzani belongs to a category known as Tombe dei Giganti, long collective burial monuments built from large stone slabs and masonry. Despite the name, they were not intended for individual elite burials. Instead, they served as communal tombs used over extended periods. The structure consists of a long burial chamber, built from upright stone slabs and capped with horizontal stones. This chamber is set behind a prominent semicircular forecourt known as an exedra. The exedra is formed by curved standing stones radiating outward from a central point. At the center of the exedra stands a tall stone slab, often referred to as a stele. At Li Mizzani, this central stone is carefully shaped and placed, creating a focal point that draws attention toward the entrance of the burial chamber behind it. The entrance itself is low and narrow. Access requires bending or crouching, slowing movement, and limiting visibility. This restriction suggests controlled interaction rather than open access. Entry into the tomb was deliberate and likely ceremonial. The burial chamber extends horizontally into the ground, creating an enclosed space that isolates the interior from light and sound. Its length exceeds what would be necessary for a single interment, reinforcing its role as a collective structure. Construction. Materials were sourced locally. Granite slabs were selected, shaped minimally, and set upright using dry stone techniques. Stability was achieved through weight, placement, and backfilling rather than mortar. The scale of individual stones is significant but not extreme. The effort lies not in transporting massive blocks over long distances, but in organizing repeated construction across the length of the monument. Excavations at similar tombs have revealed remains of multiple individuals, often deposited over long periods. Burials were typically secondary, meaning bones were placed after initial decomposition elsewhere. Grave goods associated with these tombs are limited. Pottery fragments, beads, and small bronze items have been found, but not in large quantities. This suggests emphasis on collective identity rather than individual status. The exedra plays a critical role in how the tomb was used. Its open, curved space creates a gathering area in front of the burial chamber. This area could accommodate people during ritual activity without requiring entry into the tomb itself. Standing stones in the exedra vary in height, often decreasing in size toward the outer edges. This creates a visual rhythm that directs attention inward, toward the central stele and the tomb entrance. The alignment of Li Mizzani, like many tombs of the giants, is oriented roughly toward the southeast. While not precisely astronomical, this orientation places the monument within the path of the rising sun during a part of the year. Light would have entered the forecourt during morning hours, illuminating the entrance while leaving the interior chamber in darkness. This contrast reinforces separation between the living space outside and the enclosed space of the dead. The tomb is not isolated. It forms part of a wider Nuragic ritual landscape that includes nearby Nuraga towers, sacred wells, and standing stones. These elements were not independent. They structured movement, memory, and social practice across the territory. Unlike later monumental cemeteries, tombs of the giants were not clustered densely. Each tomb appears to have served a specific community or group, anchoring them to a particular area. Maintenance of the tomb would have been periodic. Stones shift, soil settles, and entrances erode. Continued use implies collective responsibility for upkeep rather than abandonment after a single phase. The absence of defensive features indicates that protection was not the primary concern. The tomb's significance lay in continuity and visibility rather than security. Li Mizzani's design emphasizes horizontal extension rather than vertical display. This distinguishes Nuragic funerary architecture from later Mediterranean traditions that favored towering monuments or elaborate facades. the use of curved forms in the exedra contrasts with a linear burial chamber, creating a transition from open communal space to enclosed interior. This spatial progression structured how people interacted with the monument. Gathering occurred outside. Entry was restricted. The dead were placed beyond immediate reach. The tomb does not present inscriptions or imagery. Meaning was communicated through form, repetition, and placement rather than text or decoration. The name Tomb of the Giants reflects later folklore rather than original belief. However, the monument's scale relative to human bodies would have reinforced a sense of ancestral presence and continuity. The tomb's position within the landscape ensures visibility without dominance. It is encountered through movement rather than commanding attention from afar. Lee Mazzani demonstrates how neurologic communities use stone to create shared spaces for remembrance, rather than individual commemoration. Its architecture encodes collective memory into the terrain, binding group identity to a fixed point through repeated ritual engagement. The monument remains where it was built, continuing to shape how the surrounding land is read and used long after its original builders are gone. Cuelap Fortress. Cuelap is located in northern Peru, high above the Utcubamba Valley in the Amazonas region. The site sits at an elevation of roughly 3,000 meters within a cloud forest environment characterized by persistent mist, heavy rainfall, and steep slopes. Unlike the open highland plateaus of the southern Andes, this landscape is dense and enclosed, shaping how architecture interacts with terrain. Archaeologically, the site is identified as Cuelap. Construction is attributed to the Chachapoya culture, whose occupation in this region dates primarily from around the 6th to the 15th centuries CE. Cuelap predates Inca expansion into the area and represents a distinct regional tradition rather than an imperial project. The most striking feature of Cuelap is its massive outer wall. In places, the wall rises more than 20 meters above the slope, forming an enclosure that runs for nearly 600 meters. Built from limestone blocks set in courses, the wall follows the contours of the ridge, adapting to natural irregularities rather than imposing a rigid geometric plan. The scale of this wall immediately suggests defensive intent. However, Cuelap is not a simple fortress. The wall encloses a long, narrow platform containing hundreds of circular stone structures organized into neighborhoods, ceremonial spaces, and controlled pathways. Access into the enclosed area is extremely restricted. Only 3 main entrances are known, each formed as a narrow corridor that gradually tightens toward the interior. At their narrowest points, these entrances are barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. This design forces movement into a single-file approach, eliminating the possibility of rapid entry or group advance. From above, defenders could observe and control anyone attempting to enter. The architecture embeds defense into circulation rather than relying solely on walls. Inside the enclosure, the ground rises gradually. The internal surface is not flat but terraced subtly, guiding movement upward through the site. This elevation change reinforces hierarchy of space, with higher areas holding different functions than lower ones. The majority of internal structures are circular stone buildings. These were likely domestic in function, used as dwellings or storage. Their uniformity suggests shared building norms, rather than elite architectural differentiation. Walls of these buildings were constructed using smaller stones than the outer fortification, often with decorative friezes set into the exterior. These friezes include zigzag and diamond patterns formed from small stone inserts. Such decoration contrasts with the stark exterior wall. Inside Cuelap, attention shifts from mass and defense to repetition and pattern. This suggests that internal life emphasized identity and continuity rather than display of power. Some areas within Cuelap differ from residential zones. Larger platforms and open spaces appear to have served ceremonial or communal functions. One of the most prominent is a tall internal structure sometimes referred to as El Tintero, a conical building whose function remains debated. Burials have been found beneath floors and within walls of some structures, indicating that domestic and funerary space overlapped. This practice anchors ancestry directly within living space rather than separating the dead into distant cemeteries. Construction of Cuelap required sustained labor over long periods. Quarrying stone, transporting it along steep slopes, and assembling massive walls in a wet environment demanded organization and coordination. Unlike Inca stonework, Chachapoya masonry does not emphasize perfect joints or polygonal fitting. Stability was achieved through thickness, repetition, and infill rather than precision cutting. The choice of ridgetop location provided natural advantages. Steep slopes limit access, cloud cover reduces visibility from below, and elevation offers control over movement through the valley. Despite its defensive features, Kulab does not appear to have been a purely military installation. The density of domestic structures suggests long-term habitation rather than temporary refuge. Water management was integrated into the site. Channels and drainage systems prevented runoff from undermining walls and structures. In a region of heavy rainfall, this was essential for survival. The enclosure wall also functions as a retaining structure, stabilizing the platform against erosion. Its thickness and height reflect environmental as much as defensive concerns. Kuelap's position within the Chachapoya territory indicates that it was a central place, possibly serving as an administrative or ceremonial hub rather than a frontier outpost. When the Inca expanded into the region in the late 15th century, Kuelap was already established. The site was incorporated into the imperial system, but not fundamentally rebuilt in Inca style. Following the Spanish conquest, Kuelap was abandoned. Unlike Cusco or other Inca centers, it was not repurposed extensively. The cloud forest gradually reclaimed the site, preserving structures beneath vegetation. Modern excavation has revealed the complexity of Kuelap's layout, correcting earlier assumptions that it was simply a fortress. Its design integrates defense, habitation, ritual, and landscape management. The massive outer wall draws immediate attention, but it is the internal organization that reveals how the site functioned daily. Kuelap demonstrates a form of monumentality rooted in enclosure rather than vertical display. Power is expressed through control of access and space rather than through towering structures. The architecture does not dominate the ridge through height alone. It stabilizes, contains, and organizes the terrain, turning a narrow ridge into a livable environment. Kuelap remains fixed within the cloud forest, its walls continuing to shape movement, visibility, and interpretation long after its builders left the region.